The sun was barely a smear of orange over the horizon when Jonah McCall stirred from his sparse tent, the wind carrying grit and the faint metallic tang of distant machinery. His ranch, a sprawling expanse of cracked earth and thorned scrub, had always been his refuge from the chaos of the outside world, but today the stillness felt wrong. He had seen dust plumes in the distance yesterday, nothing unusual on the plains, but now they moved with unnatural precision, like machines choreographing some grim ballet. Jonah tightened the straps on his worn tactical vest, checking the pistol at his hip and the rifle slung across his back. Sensors rigged along the perimeter flickered weakly, the battery packs straining against the cold morning, and his gut told him something wasn't right by the time he crested the small ridge leading to the northern stretch of his property. He froze. A silhouette hung from a mesquite tree, suspended by ropes that cut into the bark, swaying gently in the wind. Jonah's stomach knotted as he squinted, catching the sun glinting off a crude wooden sign dangling across the child's chest. The letters were jagged, almost frantic. "White man don't forgive." He hadn't seen a human face like this in years, soft, terrified, framed by dark hair and the pale glow of dawn, but the eyes that met his were defiant, burning with something older than fear. Jonah approached cautiously, scanning the horizon with the rifle's scope. The landscape was deceptively calm, the plain stretching endlessly, dotted with jagged rocks and dry brush. But the arrangement of small metallic sensors embedded in the dirt betrayed a recent intrusion, a pattern that hinted at a team moving systematically, leaving traps and markers for some unknown reason. Jonah had survived decades in these unforgiving lands, relying on improvisation and intuition, but this was different. Whoever had done this had planned it, engineered the scene to convey not just threat, but message. The child's presence was the leverage. He crouched, assessing the girl. She was young, barely 10, wiry and alert, her limbs tense against the ropes. Jonah noticed the faint metallic sheen on the rope's tensile fibers that could withstand enormous weight. These weren't meant to kill quickly. Whoever had done this wanted a slow, deliberate show of power, a psychological weapon. Jonah's instincts screamed that moving recklessly could trigger some hidden mechanism, or worse. The tension was suffocating, the wind carrying an eerie silence, broken only by the girl's shallow, controlled breathing. From the ridge behind him, a faint hum grew, rhythmic and mechanical, like drones powering up. Jonah's sensors pinged erratically. The signal interference was strong, localized, and deliberate. He ducked behind a rock, scanning with the infrared overlay. Shadows moved across the horizon, small, fast, disciplined, far too coordinated to be chance. He counted 5 figures, maybe 6, lightly armored, armed with compact rail rifles. The pattern suggested reconnaissance and control of multiple angles, a classic encirclement with Overwatch, meant to intimidate or contain rather than engage directly. Jonah realized immediately that brute force wouldn't work here. Every step he took would have to be calculated, exploiting weaknesses in timing, line of sight, and terrain. The girl's eyes never left his as he spoke softly, careful not to trigger her panic. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. Can you hear me?" Her lips moved, forming words Jonah couldn't catch over the rising hum of unseen machinery. She shifted subtly, exposing the knots binding her wrists. The ropes were expertly tied, friction locks designed to resist simple cuts. But Jonah had an engineer's mind honed by years of tinkering with sensor arrays and improvised defenses. He recognized the slight slack in one of the loops, the tiny misalignment in the fibers. If he acted with patience, precision, and the environment on his side, he could free her without alerting the enemy. He inched closer, using the low rocks and the thick brush as cover, his cum relay humming quietly in his ear. "Mara, can you move your right hand toward your chest?" He whispered, relying on gestures. The girl's eyes flicked nervously, then complied, the rope stretching enough for Jonah to work a thin, coated wire under the fibers. The drones above shifted, likely scanning for heat signatures or movement. Jonah froze, holding the wire steady, feeling the vibration of distant engines through the rock under his palms. Timing would be everything. A sudden flash of movement caught his peripheral vision. One of the shadowed figures had detached from the formation, moving with silent grace across the plain. Jonah's heart pounded. The figure was approaching from the east, carrying a device that looked like a kinetic sensor array, capable of triggering either a shock or an alert. Jonah pressed flat against the ground, calculating trajectory and line of sight. He couldn't engage directly. He had to manipulate the environment. Using a small, weighted wire tethered to a rock, he released a ricochet trap, clattering a few meters away. The figure froze, recalibrating sensors, giving Jonah the precious seconds to work the rope's tension. The rope snapped with a sharp pop. Mara dropped silently to the ground, rolling instinctively to absorb the impact. Jonah grabbed her hand, pulling her behind the rocks as the intruder's sensors pinned red and the drone swarm above adjusted. Mara's breathing was ragged but controlled. Her eyes were wide with terror, but Jonah could see the spark of something deeper knowledge that survival depended on wit, not raw strength. He whispered, "We move fast. Stay low. Trust me." She nodded, gripping his hand tightly. They sprinted through a narrow corridor of scrub and rocks, Jonah analyzing every ridge and shadow for possible enemy lines. The drones swiveled, infrared overlays marking them in red. Their movements were predictable once he identified the pattern, a circular sweep with intermittent pauses, covering all escape routes. Jonah had 20 seconds to exploit the blind spot. He launched Mara over a low boulder, teaching her silently to minimize her heat signature, while he rolled over, covering her with a suppressed rail pistol. The shot hit the dirt near a drone. Relay fraying a minor sensor array without triggering the main network. As they ran, Jonah realized this was no ordinary ambush. Whoever had set this up had intimate knowledge of local terrain and likely access to off-the-grid satellite feeds. The child had been bait, yes, but also a lure to expose Jonah's capabilities. His reaction speed, his improvisation under extreme pressure. Each step forward was a chess move, a test of instinct versus calculation. He had survived long enough to know that retreat alone wouldn't solve anything. Counterintelligence, improvisation, and exploiting patterns would be essential. They reached a narrow ravine just as the first of the larger automated surveillance units descended into view. The low hum of electromagnetic shielding detectable even without sensors. Jonah whispered instructions quickly, teaching Mara to duck under the camouflage netting, to move against the flow of wind and dust, to mask heat signatures. The enemy was closing in, and he knew one mistake would mean capture or death, not just for him, but for Mara. He checked his ammo and energy reserves. One rifle, a few magazines, and a single prototype EMP device rigged in his pack. It might be enough to carve a gap if he timed it perfectly. Then a sudden crack echoed across the plain. A secondary figure, unseen until that instant, had climbed a ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. A laser designator locked on Jonah, tiny sparks glinting off the targeting system. Mara stiffened, Jonah's mind raced. Direct confrontation was suicide, but the ridge itself was loose sandstone prone to collapse. Using instinct and experience, he aimed carefully at a precarious outcrop, hitting it with a single well-placed round. Rocks tumbled down, disrupting the line of sight and throwing the designator off balance. The figure faltered, giving Jonah a narrow window. He pulled Mara into the ravine deeper, pressing against the cool earth, listening to the cacophony above. Drones swarmed in calculated arcs, but their programming didn't anticipate improvisation using environmental hazards. Jonah muttered to Mara, "You can make it if you follow me and keep your head down. Nothing else matters right now." She nodded, trust hardening in her gaze. From the ravine, Jonah scanned outward. The enemy was reorganizing, their movements now erratic. He realized they hadn't anticipated a counterintuitive response using terrain as a weapon, using observation and timing instead of brute firepower. Jonah made a decision: they wouldn't just escape. They would turn the planes against their pursuers, turning ambush into counter-ambush, but he knew the moment would be fleeting. The enemy adapted fast, and every second delayed risked detection and elimination. A low mechanical whistle rose, signaling a new wave. Jonah froze, listening to the rising thrum. More figures, more drones, and something larger armored units advancing over the distant plateau. The child's hand tightened in his, eyes wide but resolute. Jonah whispered, "Hold on, we're not finished yet." The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic resonance, a warning, and the distant flash of something impossible, a precision-engineered quadrone, far faster and smarter than anything Jonah had seen in the field. It hovered on the ridge, scanning in arcs, its sensors locked on Mara's faint heat signature. Jonah's mind raced, assembling a plan in fractions of a second. He had one shot to manipulate the terrain, the environment, and the mechanical beast before it spotted them fully. One misstep would be fatal. He picked up a rock, assessing weight and trajectory. They emerged on the other side of the ravine just as the dust settled. Jonah allowed himself a brief glance back. The quadrone hovered, recalculating, momentarily confused, its optical sensors jittering. Jonah knew it would adapt fast. The fight for survival had just begun, and the enemy was more cunning, more prepared than he could have imagined. But for now, Mara was alive, and they had carved the first victory out of chaos. The plains stretched endlessly ahead, each ridge and valley a potential battlefield. Jonah's gaze hardened. Whoever had left the girl hanging had underestimated one thing. A desperate human with nothing to lose and everything to protect could bend rules, logic, and physics to survive. But the sign, "White man don't forgive," haunted him. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. And somewhere out there, someone was waiting to make it true. Jonah knew their reprieve would be measured in minutes, not hours. The chase, the countermeasures, the strategy, it had only just begun. He looked down at Mara, whose small hand still gripped his with steel-like resolve. "We'll make it," he said, though both knew it was a vow to a war just starting, not a guarantee. The hum of drones and the glint of distant surveillance hinted at adversaries already calculating their next move. Jonah swallowed hard, gripping his rifle tighter. The first part of survival had been improvisation and instinct. The next would demand intellect, cunning, and sacrifice. Somewhere out there, enemies were plotting, and he would need every ounce of his mind and body to turn the plains into their undoing. The wind picked up again, and the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the fractured land. Jonah and Mara crouched low, scanning, calculating, moving through the landscape like ghosts. Somewhere behind them, a faint vibration hummed through the earth, the unmistakable sign that the enemy was mobilizing for a counterstrike. Jonah's teeth clenched. This was more than survival. It was the opening gambit in a conflict that would test every moral, physical, and tactical limit they possessed. And then a faint signal blinked on Jonah's portable comm unit, a silent ping. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. Someone else was here. Someone with intel. Or a warning. Jonah froze, heart hammering, calculating whether to investigate or ignore. The choice could cost them both their lives. He looked at Mara, her eyes steady and unyielding, and made the decision. They would move toward it. But as they advanced, the ground beneath them trembled subtly, and Jonah realized with a sinking sense of dread that the planes themselves had become a weapon in the enemy's design. The cliffhanger hung heavy in the air. Every step forward might be their last, and every choice would ripple across a battlefield still unseen, a war still in its earliest, most dangerous moments. Jonah tightened his grip on Mora's hand and started running, not away, but into the unknown. Jonah and Mara slipped through the fractured plain, the hum of distant drones pulsing through the air like a low heartbeat. The landscape had changed subtly since their first escape. Craggy ridges loomed closer, jagged stone formations cutting shadows across the sand like claws. Jonah kept his rifle raised, scanning each movement, while Mara's small form clung tightly to his side. The ping from the portable comm device had led them here, to a shallow depression carved by centuries of wind and erosion. From this vantage point, Jonah could see the enemy reorganizing beyond the northern ridge, armored units crawling into position, drones hovering with precise, lethal grace, and small, humanoid figures moving in systematic sweeps. It was an overwhelming force, yet the patterning revealed a subtle flaw. The enemy's movements were rigid, optimized for predictability, leaving them vulnerable to adaptive maneuvers. Jonah's mind raced. He needed more than brute force. They had to exploit terrain, timing, and psychological advantage. Mara, sensing his tension, whispered, "They're not human, are they?" Jonah's eyes flicked toward her, reading fear wrapped in instinctive understanding. "They are," he said slowly, "but trained, enhanced, and programmed to act faster than most. We'll have to think faster." He crouched behind a jagged boulder, pulling out a small tablet connected to his sensor arrays. The data streams were raw, partially scrambled by the enemy's jamming field, but Jonah could parse patterns, flight paths of drones, patrol intervals, weak spots in the electromagnetic grid. "Here," he murmured. Tracing a finger across the heat maps, there's a blind corridor, about 20 meters wide, opens for 30 seconds every rotation. If we time it right, we can slip through. Mara nodded, her body tight with anticipation. Jonah felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. This was no longer just survival, it was a tactical operation requiring improvisation under pressure. Balancing the threat to Mara against the risk of exposing himself, they moved. Shadows against the earth, feet stirring dust that rose like a muted fog. Every step was choreographed. Mara mimicked Jonah's low stance, keeping heat signatures obscured while he guided her through depressions in the sand, behind outcrops that interrupted drone sweeps. A distant flash of light indicated a new unit approaching, a humanoid silhouette carrying what looked like a kinetic pulse cannon capable of rapid suppression fire. Jonah froze, counting rotations in his head. The blind corridor would close in 15 seconds. Timing was everything. He gritted his teeth, calculating trajectory and exposure. With Mara following precisely, they darted across the gap, Jonah laying down a short, suppressive smoke device, a mixture of dust dispersal and minor heat, masking enough to confuse the optical sensors momentarily. The enemy figure paused, scanning, and Jonah seized the moment. They slipped into the depression, hearts pounding, lungs burning. He allowed himself a brief glance. The landscape had shifted again, the enemy reorganizing, unaware of the small breach. But not for long. Breathing hard, Jonah whispered, "We need intel, fast, otherwise we'll be running blind until they corner us." Mara's fingers brushed his arm, silent affirmation. They pressed deeper into the ravine system, the walls narrowing, forcing a single-file approach. The earth was cool beneath their palms, shadows blending them against detection. Jonah's tablet pinged faintly, a signal stronger than before. Someone else was out there, an operative embedded somewhere in the northern sector. The unknown agent had left traces of their path, just enough to guide Jonah toward safety or perhaps toward a trap. The risk was monumental, but the opportunity for tactical advantage was worth it. They reached a wider chamber, natural information but partially reinforced with scrap metal, suggesting recent occupation. Jonah's heart skipped. This could be a staging area for the enemy or the source of the Kumping. Mara clutched his hand, and he gave her a reassuring nod. He crouched to examine a series of scattered devices, small kinetic traps, energy emitters, and half-buried relay arrays. The tech was sophisticated, yet modular, clearly designed to be deployed and redeployed quickly, adapting to environmental feedback. Jonah's mind ticked. He could reverse engineer these to feed false data, create temporary blind spots, maybe even lure enemy forces into predictable positions. Suddenly, movement at the far end of the chamber, a figure appeared, partially silhouetted. Jonah froze, assessing posture and intent. The operative stepped forward slowly, hands raised slightly, voice modulated through a tactical filter. "Jonah McCall, I've been waiting." The voice was calm, measured, but underlaid with urgency. Jonah's instincts screamed caution. He didn't know if this was an ally, a defector, or a decoy designed to draw them into a trap. "Who are you?" Jonah demanded, keeping his weapon trained. The figure lowered their visor, revealing a faint trace of recognition, someone from intelligence networks, perhaps, or a mercenary with ties to global operations. "Call me Sarah," the operative replied. "I have information about the girl, about why they left her for you to find." Mara's grip tightened. Jonah signaled for silence. Every syllable mattered, every nuance could betray intent. Sarah stepped closer, producing a small holotablet. Projections shimmered in the dusty air, maps of local terrain, drone flight paths, patrol schedules, and a network of underground supply caches. Jonah studied the data. The enemy was more organized than he had feared. Logistics nodes, temporary command hubs, weaponized drones integrated with rapid response units. Their objective wasn't immediate kill. It was data acquisition, psychological pressure, and perhaps testing human response under extreme conditions. Jonah's mind calculated options. Engaging directly would be suicidal. Their survival depended on leveraging intel and improvisation, exploiting weak points in cycles and timing. Zira continued. "The girl Mara is not just a child. They've chosen her for something critical. Her presence is a key. She carries encoded knowledge within her, something you won't understand, but they do. That sign, 'White Man Don't Forgive,' isn't just threat. It's a warning, a claim, and a marker for future operations. They want her to lead you here, to provoke you into a predictable pattern. They've been observing your tactics, your improvisation, every move calculated." Jonah felt a chill. This wasn't just a localized ambush, it was an orchestration. A psychological experiment wrapped in strategic aggression. Jonah's gaze flicked to Mara. Her eyes were unwavering, but he sensed the moral weight pressing on her. She wasn't just a victim. "We'll use it, but only at the apex point. Timing is everything." The operation began immediately. Jonah guided Mara through a narrow tunnel leading to an overlook, affording a view of a drone grid now recalibrating after their initial breach. He deployed decoy heat sources along likely patrol paths, a series of controlled distractions designed to exploit the rigid predictability Sarah had highlighted. Mara followed instructions flawlessly, crouching behind rocks, moving silently, her gaze sharp. Jonah allowed a rare glance at her. Despite fear, her instincts and resolve were remarkable. Every misstep could be fatal. Yet she remained composed, evidence that human adaptability could rival technological precision. Suddenly, a kinetic pulse flared from a distant ridge, an automated response to the decoy. Jonah's improvised shield absorbed some energy. but a small debris explosion signaled that their presence had been partially detected. He muttered, "We've got a partial alert. Adjust immediately." Using hand signals, he guided Mara to a shadowed overhang. Sarah deployed the jammer, sending a pulse that briefly blinded the quad drones above, forcing them into a short loop of recalibration. This created a 30-second window. Jonah calculated every step, sprint across exposed terrain, leverage rocks as shields, deploy a minor explosive to simulate misdirection. The sprint was brutal. Sand and dust bit at their faces, muscles screamed, but timing was perfect. Mara mirrored every movement, shadows slipping past mechanical eyes. Jonah threw a small weighted wire, knocking a sensor offline and creating a diversion that drew one patrol unit away. The plan worked, but barely. Jonah felt a small sting along his arm, a scratch from a nearby shard, evidence of close proximity danger. They pressed on Dot by the time they reached a deeper ravine. Jonah allowed himself a brief exhale. "Partial victory," he whispered. But Sarah's face betrayed unease. "This is only phase 1. The enemy adapts fast. They will probe again, and next time, it will be more dangerous. Your resources are limited. Ammo, fuel, energy, every choice counts." Jonah absorbed this, knowing that even their small win carried enormous cost. From the shadows, a faint signal pulsed a transmission from another operative, likely an embedded ally. The frequency was faint, distorted, yet readable. Jonah leaned closer, decoding rapidly. The message contained a warning. Enemy forces were converging toward a centralized cache, a note critical to both Mara's knowledge and the enemy's operations. Capturing it would provide leverage, but the approach was heavily monitored. The terrain offered some tactical advantage, but one misstep could trigger a kinetic cascade, neutralizing any chance of stealth. Jonah's mind raced through alternatives: feints, environmental manipulation, split teams, but they were too few to risk dispersal. Mara's hand squeezed his. "We can do this, can't we?" Her eyes reflected courage and calculation, a mirror to his own grit. Jonah nodded, internalizing the stakes, the moral cost of survival, the responsibility to protect her, and the tactical necessity of exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. He glanced at Sarah, who offered a silent nod. The alliance was fragile but necessary. They had to act fast, and they had to act smart. As they readied for the next maneuver, the earth beneath them trembled suddenly, almost imperceptibly. Jonah froze, ears straining. The enemy had deployed heavy units, moving toward choke points, likely intending to compress their corridor of escape and force a decisive engagement. Timing was now critical. Hesitation meant death. Jonah recalculated, adjusting movement patterns and timing sequences for Mara and Sarah. Every second counted. Every decision carried weight beyond simple survival. And then, from the northern horizon, a plume of smoke rose, signaling the first offensive strike by the enemy's main contingent. Jonah's teeth clenched. Their partial success had been noted, and retaliation was imminent. He whispered, "Hold on. Phase 2 begins now." Mara's fingers tightened on his hand. Sarah adjusted the jammer, energy reserves dwindling fast. The tactical game had escalated. One error would cost them everything. Jonah took a deep breath, surveying the terrain, the enemy, and his own limited resources. The cliffhanger hit hard. The enemy knew the girl's value. They had adapted to initial improvisations, and their next strike would test every ounce of Jonah's strategic mind, every muscle, every moral boundary. The battle had moved from survival to high-stakes engagement, where ingenuity, courage, and timing would decide life or death. Jonah glanced at Mara, eyes steely. "We're not done yet. Not by far." The wind had shifted again, carrying a sharp metallic tang that Jonah recognized instantly. It wasn't dust or ozone, it was heat from distant reactors. The unmistakable signature of armored units advancing across the plateau. Jonah crouched low with Mara and Sarah behind a jagged outcrop. The portable comm unit silent now, the signals faint and erratic. Every map they had was partially compromised. The enemy had adapted faster than he'd anticipated, recalibrating patrols and drone sweeps. Jonah traced the edges of the plateau with his eyes, counting units and assessing firing arcs. The landscape was no longer just terrain. It had become a lethal three-dimensional chessboard, and they were the only moving pieces. "We need to disrupt their logistics before they compress us," Jonah whispered. "Every unit we can immobilize buys us seconds, maybe minutes. That's all the leverage we have." Mara's grip on his hand tightened, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. She had begun to read patterns instinctively, her small form translating observation into action almost automatically. Jonah allowed himself a grim nod. Sarah adjusted the jammer device strapped to her back, flicking switches that sent micropulses into the nearby sensor network. Red lights blinked across distant drones, some recalibrating, others going into temporary blind loops. The moment was brief, but enough. They moved silently along the narrow corridor formed by fractured sandstone, slipping past automated sentries that hummed with lethal intent. Jonah's mind worked in fractions of a second. Route selection, line of sight angles, timing sequences for each pulse, and the precise placement of decoy heat signatures. The first cache of enemy supplies came into view, a camouflaged compound with stacked crates, portable energy cells, and a small platoon of armored units. Jonah signaled Mara and Sierra. They had to act fast. Jonah pulled a compact EMP device from his pack. Its charge would last for only 15 seconds, enough to fry circuitry in a targeted radius, but not more. He whispered instructions quickly, distributing many decoy transmitters to create the illusion of multiple teams approaching from different angles. Mara and Sarah moved into position. Jonah activated the EMP. The pulse radiated outward in a silent wave, and red lights blinked across the supply nodes. Alarms flared briefly, then the compound went dark. Mechanical arms froze mid-motion. Drones hovered inert, and soldiers cursed in frustration. Jonah felt a brief surge of satisfaction. The gambit had worked, but it was costly. Every pulse left them exposed if the enemy recalibrated. Before they could move further, the sound of boots crunching on sand reached them, a patrol they hadn't accounted for. Jonah crouched low, estimating range and line of sight. He fired a single suppressed round, taking out a sensor array, then used a weighted wire to topple a stack of crates, creating cover. The patrol scattered, disoriented, and Jonah pulled Mara and Sarah deeper into the shadows. The enemy was learning quickly, each misstep feeding their predictive algorithms. Jonah knew that their next exposure could be fatal. The operation required more than stealth. It required deception. Jonah devised a plan: strike the communication hub, force a reroute of command signals, then infiltrate the secondary supply node for intelligence. Sierra assisted, overlaying predictive drone paths on Jonah's tablet. Mara's role became clear. Her small size and agility allowed her to slip into tight spaces, planting decoys and manipulating minor mechanisms. Jonah's calculations were precise. Every second, every meter, and every pulse of the jammer had to be synchronized to prevent detection. As they approached the comm hub, Jonah's heart sank. The hub was protected by reinforced kinetic barriers, automated turrets, and a rotating patrol of 4 enhanced operatives. Their armor reflected electromagnetic scans. Conventional attacks would fail. Jonah scanned the terrain. The hub sat atop a narrow ridge, flanked by sheer drop-offs. He realized an opportunity: leverage gravity, terrain instability, and momentum. Using Sarah's microjammer, they temporarily disabled a turret, then used ropes and improvised pulleys to drop a weighted device onto the ridge, creating controlled debris and a momentary blind spot. Mara moved like a shadow, placing decoys inside the hub while Jonah kept overwatch. The raid was surgical. Within minutes, they had captured critical intel encrypted schedules, drone patrol algorithms, and a log revealing a hidden underground cache containing the next phase of the enemy's operation. But victory came at a cost. Mara had scraped her arm on jagged metal, bleeding slightly, and Jonah's vest had absorbed a near miss from a patrol returning faster than expected. Sarah adjusted her sensors, whispering, "We've bought minutes, but they will regroup and they'll adapt." Jonah's mind raced. They had disrupted the system, but now they were marked. The stakes had escalated. Every move would be countered, every tactical advantage temporary. Mara's eyes mirrored his concern. They were not just battling humans, they were contending with a system that learned. They reached a narrow chasm and paused, scanning the horizon. That's when the betrayal struck. Sarah's unit blinked rapidly, an incoming transmission from a trusted channel, supposedly friendly forces. Jonah answered cautiously. The voice on the other end sounded familiar, authoritative, but the message was clear. Abort operation immediately. Extraction compromised. You are on your own. Jonah's blood ran cold. The channel had been hijacked, a false signal designed to mislead them. The operatives behind it were not allies. They had anticipated Jonah's moves, feeding him misinformation to create predictable patterns. Jonah's mind raced. They were not only facing a better prepared enemy, they were being manipulated from within. The moral weight of the situation pressed heavily. Trust had fractured. They could rely on no one beyond themselves. Every decision now carried the weight of betrayal, and failure would mean not only death, but capture and exploitation of Mara's knowledge. Jonah clenched his teeth. They would continue, but every move had to be calculated with ruthless precision. He devised a risky countermeasure. Instead of retreating along familiar paths, he would use the ravine system to their advantage, navigating underground channels that the enemy's sensors could not detect. The plan was fraught with danger, narrow passages, unstable ceilings, potential hidden traps, but it was their only chance to regain initiative. Mara followed closely, her small hands steady on ropes and rock edges, while Sarah's portable sensors detected vibrations and mapped safe zones in near real-time dot as they moved. Jonah reflected on the broader stakes. The girl Mara was a pivot point, her presence a catalyst for both psychological and strategic warfare. The enemy's fixation on her suggested her knowledge or abilities were critical. Jonah resolved to protect her at all costs, even as he calculated offensive strikes and manipulations to regain control. Every decoy, every timed pulse, every movement through shadowed tunnels became part of a larger game. A battle of wits against a system designed to anticipate and neutralize improvisation. They emerged near the underground cache, a concealed chamber brimming with supplies, energy cells, and advanced surveillance devices. Jonah allowed himself a brief glance at Mara. Her eyes were determined, fearless in a way that belied her age. He felt a surge of responsibility, not only as a protector, but as a strategist. They could use this cache to create a foothold, to strike at the enemy's logistical core, but it would require precise timing, coordination, and absolute secrecy. Jonah began the operation, overlaying the cache's map with predictive patrol patterns. He assigned Mara the task of planting signal disruptors at critical nodes, small devices that would create temporary blind spots, allowing them to move undetected. Sarah monitored the external perimeter, sending intermittent pulses to mislead the enemy's sensors. Every move had a cost, every second counted. Jonah felt the tension in his muscles, the pounding of adrenaline, but he knew this was necessary. The stakes had shifted. Survival was intertwined with tactical advantage. moral responsibility, and the unpredictable human element. Just as they completed the initial setup, a sound echoed from the depths of the ravine, a soft, deliberate movement, too precise to be random. Jonah froze, scanning the passage. Shadows shifted. An enemy unit had located a secondary entrance, closing in silently. Mara tensed, gripping his hand. Sarah's sensors flickered in panic mode, detecting multiple heat signatures converging. Jonah whispered instructions quickly, coordinating movements through tunnels and debris cover. They had seconds to react, every action synchronized, every decision deliberate. The enemy emerged, enhanced operatives moving with lethal precision. Jonah triggered the first set of decoys, sending thermal signals in opposite directions while he and Mara slipped through a narrow fissure in the rock. Sarah followed, using her jammer to mask their escape. The operatives faltered, scanning the wrong corridors, their predictive algorithms disrupted. Jonah's heart pounded, muscles screaming, but the counterintuitive tactics worked. They gained distance, but not without consequence. A near-miss pulse grazed Mara's shoulder, a reminder that even success carried a cost. Breathing heavily, Jonah allowed himself a brief assessment. They had survived the raid, captured critical intel, and maintained control over their movements, but the enemy had adapted again, faster than he had anticipated. And now, the betrayal and manipulations had introduced a new variable. They could not trust any external channels. Jonah realized that moving forward would require complete autonomy, reliant solely on instinct, tactical acumen, and Mara's unexpected resilience. The cliffhanger hit when Jonah scanned the horizon one last time. A faint shimmer in the distance, an armored unit, unlike any they had encountered, moving with a silent, unstoppable momentum toward the ravine entrance. It carried what looked like a kinetic disruptor capable of collapsing their escape corridor. Jonah's teeth clenched. The next move would not be just a battle of stealth and deception, it would be a direct confrontation. A test of discipline, coordination, and courage. With Mara's life and their mission hanging in the balance, the early morning light cast fractured shadows across the ravine, highlighting every ridge, boulder, and hidden passage. Jonah crouched behind a jagged outcrop, Mara pressed close to his side, Sarah scanning the horizon with her portable sensors. The enemy's heavy unit, the kinetic disruptor they had glimpsed from the plateau, was advancing, moving with uncanny precision, almost as if the terrain itself had been mapped into its memory. Jonah's mind worked furiously, calculating angles, distances, and timing sequences. There was no margin for error. Every misstep could collapse their path, leaving them trapped or exposed. Jonah outlined the plan in terse whispers. They would split the enemy's focus using decoys and environmental manipulation. Mara would deploy signal disruptors and choke points along the approach, forcing the unit to divert and overcorrect. Sarah would control the external jamming, creating blind zones that would give Jonah the opportunity to manipulate terrain features on stable ridges, loose boulders, and narrow fissures to channel the enemy into predictable paths. It was a high-risk operation, the kind that relied on anticipation, timing, and absolute discipline. The first phase began immediately. Mara moved with silent precision, placing tiny disruptor nodes along the path. Each device emitted micropulses that interfered with the kinetic unit's targeting array, forcing minor course corrections. Jonah pressed a hand to her shoulder, signaling calm. Sarah triggered the jamming pulse, sending drones above into temporary recalibration loops. The enemy paused, sensors scanning erratically, their predictable momentum disrupted for the first time. Jonah gritted his teeth and readied the terrain traps he had improvised. Loose slabs of rock, precarious boulders balanced on the edge of ridges, and gravity-fed debris channels dotted as the kinetic disruptor advanced. Jonah detonated the first set of weights. Rocks tumbled down the ravine, forcing the enemy into a narrow passage where its mobility was constrained. The unit's kinetic dampers activated, but the terrain slowed its movement. Jonah and Mara slipped along the side, staying out of sight. Sarah's eyes flicked across her tablet, noting weak points and timing intervals. "We've got 20 seconds before it recalibrates," she whispered. Jonah nodded. Every second was precious. Every action had to be precise. They continued the maneuver, using shadows and terrain masking to maintain cover. Jonah's mind ran through contingencies. If the enemy attempted a lateral bypass, they would use a secondary channel. If it tried to accelerate, Mara's signal nodes would disrupt its stabilizers. The coordination was delicate, a dance of humans against machine. And it was working. Each calculated step turned the enemy's advantages into vulnerabilities. But then, a sudden flash of movement to the east. Jonah froze. A small team of enhanced operatives had appeared, likely redeployed to flank them. Sarah's sensors pinned furiously, showing multiple heat signatures converging. Jonah's pulse quickened, but he didn't panic. He had anticipated adaptive maneuvers. Using the narrow fissure as a natural funnel, he positioned Mara and Sarah behind cover while he took a calculated shot with his suppressed rail pistol. The round hit a control module on a drone, causing a cascade of errors in the flanking unit's sensors. Jonah muttered, "Move." They advanced through the channel, exploiting the temporary confusion. Jonah used the terrain to block line of sight, maneuvering through narrow passages that forced the enemy to slow. Mara, surprisingly agile, deployed another disruptor node, further confusing the enhanced operatives. Sarah guided their movements remotely, monitoring vibrations and sensor anomalies. Jonah's mind raced, calculating the timing for their next move, a pivotal gamble that would decide whether they could break the enemy's cordon entirely. The decision point arrived at a collapse tunnel, a natural choke point with sheer drops on either side. Jonah assessed the situation. The kinetic unit and the flanking operatives were converging, their path now constrained. Jonah had rigged a series of boulders with tension lines and weighted triggers. If released precisely, they would tumble down, forcing the enemy into a confined zone where mobility and stabilizers would be compromised. Timing was critical. It wasn't victory yet, but it was leverage dot as they moved deeper into the ravine system. Jonah felt the moral weight pressing on him. Every maneuver, every deception carried consequences. Mara's presence made this personal. Her courage was extraordinary, but the psychological toll was immense. Jonah whispered reassurances, though both knew the cost of failure was extreme. The enemy had demonstrated adaptability, ruthlessness, and tactical acumen. Survival depended not only on skill, but on human resilience and moral clarity. They approached the underground cache identified earlier. Jonah reviewed the intel they had captured, the enemy's supply chains, patrol rotations, and strategic objectives. Mara's role was now critical. Her small size and nimble movements allowed her to place sensors and disruptors with precision, creating temporary blind zones that granted Jonah access to high-value targets. Sarah provided oversight, coordinating timing, and monitoring enemy adaptation. Together, they were executing a multi-vector operation that required synchronization, trust, and courage. The entrance to the cache was partially blocked by debris, likely from previous operations. Jonah assessed the structural integrity, noting weak points and potential collapse zones. He rigged tension lines to move the debris safely, while Mara placed signal disruptors to mask their presence. Sarah monitored vibrations and telemetry, ensuring the enemy remained unaware of their approach. The work was meticulous, each step deliberate, balancing speed and caution. Inside the cache, Jonah discovered advanced surveillance equipment, energy reserves, and encrypted data drives. The intel confirmed the enemy's strategic focus. Mara's knowledge was a key to a larger operation, one that extended beyond the local theater. Jonah realized that the stakes were global. Mara's survival and their ability to manipulate tactical advantage could influence outcomes far beyond the ravine dot as they prepared to exfiltrate. A sudden alert rang through Sarah's sensors. Reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions, faster than anticipated. Jonah's pulse quickened. The enemy had adapted again, anticipating patterns he had hoped were unpredictable. They had to act immediately. Jonah orchestrated their movement through narrow passages, using terrain to block line of sight and channel the enemy into predictable paths. Mara deployed final disruptors, creating temporary blind zones. Sarah coordinated remotely, monitoring vibrations, heat signatures, and telemetry. The kinetic unit advanced, faster and more adaptive than before. Jonah calculated one final gambit, leveraged the underground structure to force the enemy into a confined space, where terrain, gravity, and improvisation would neutralize technological advantage. He signaled Mara and Sarah, and they executed the maneuver flawlessly. The enemy was channeled into a narrow corridor. Debris tumbled, sensors scrambled, and mobility was constrained. Jonah allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The decisive moment had arrived, but as they prepared to move to the final extraction point, Jonah sensed a deeper threat. Shadows shifted, revealing an operative they hadn't anticipated, a figure who had infiltrated their path undetected, likely the source of prior misdirections. Jonah froze, calculating risk. Mara's eyes widened, but she held her position. Sarah's sensors confirmed the presence, showing multiple concealed devices. The operative moved with lethal precision, a single misstep capable of collapse, capture, or worse. Jonah's mind raced through contingencies. His tactical acumen pushed to the limit. The cliffhanger struck hard. The path to extraction was now blocked. The enemy adaptive and lethal, and their survival depended on outthinking a human-machine hybrid whose movements were both unpredictable and precise. Jonah knew that the next sequence of actions, decisions, sacrifices, and manipulations would determine not only immediate survival, but the outcome of a larger strategic objective. Mara's presence, Sarah's oversight, and his own resolve had brought them this far. But the ultimate test loomed, a confrontation that would require cunning, discipline, and absolute trust. The ravine had grown silent, an uneasy stillness punctuated by the distant hum of recalibrating drones and the faint hiss of cooling kinetic units. Jonah crouched behind the fractured rock, Mara pressed close, Sarah scanning from the rear. Their extraction point lay ahead, a narrow crevice leading to an open plateau beyond the enemy's immediate reach. But the path was no longer simply physical. It was a complex battlefield of timing, deception, and human calculation. Every second, every step could trigger detection or lethal engagement. Jonah's pulse thrummed with urgency, yet his mind remained razor-sharp, calculating contingencies and prioritizing objectives. Mara's small hand gripped his, a reminder that this operation was as much about survival as it was about protecting a critical life. They advanced cautiously, shadows merging with jagged rock formations. Jonah's plan relied on precise timing of the terrain-based traps, signal disruptors, and the enemy's predictable adaptations. He had studied every potential line of sight, every sensor sweep, every patrol rotation. Mara deployed the first disruptor node, masking thermal signatures, while Sarah amplified micro-jamming pulses to confuse enemy sensors. The kinetic unit advanced ahead, moving cautiously through the ravine as Jonah had anticipated. Its stabilizers hummed, energy output rising with each attempted correction. Jonah signaled the next phase, using the natural gradient of the terrain. Jonah triggered a controlled collapse. A series of rocks and debris fell toward the kinetic unit, forcing it into a narrow corridor where its maneuverability was compromised. Mara darted along the edges, her movements silent and precise, placing additional disruptors to mask their exfiltration. Sarah monitored every variable: vibrations, heat signatures, electronic feedback communicating adjustments with terse signals. Jonah allowed himself no moment of relief. One misstep could collapse the corridor or trigger a lethal counterstrike. The enemy operatives, adaptive and relentless, adjusted to the initial traps, attempting to flank and intercept. Jonah had anticipated this. He deployed secondary terrain manipulations, hidden ledges, tensioned rocks ready to tumble, and narrow fissures designed to slow pursuit. Mara and Sarah followed in perfect synchronization, their timing critical to maintain stealth and advantage. Jonah felt the weight of the operation pressing on him: moral responsibility, tactical precision, and the unpredictable human element all converging as they approached the final extraction point. Jonah glimpsed a larger threat. The enemy had deployed a mobile kinetic disruptor equipped with adaptive tracking. Its sensors scanned with lightning speed, capable of targeting energy sources and structural weaknesses. Jonah realized that conventional evasion would fail. They needed a combination of improvisation, physics, and coordination. He signaled Mara to deploy a thermal decoy while Sarah prepared a concentrated jamming pulse. Jonah moved into position, calculating the optimal angle and timing to manipulate the disruptor's momentum. The plan was executed flawlessly. Mara's decoy drew the unit's attention. Sarah's pulse scrambled its adaptive targeting, and Jonah triggered a tensioned rock collapse to destabilize its footing. The disruptor staggered, its balance compromised, allowing Jonah and the team to slip past undetected. They emerged onto the plateau, the morning sun cutting across the horizon, revealing a stretch of relatively open terrain leading to a prearranged extraction zone. For a brief moment, survival seemed tangible, but Jonah knew the enemy's reach extended far beyond sight. That suddenly, a flare illuminated the plateau, a remote signal marking their position. Jonah froze, assessing. Reinforcements had been dispatched, adaptive units moving with lethal intent. Their extraction window had narrowed to mere minutes. Jonah coordinated the team. Mara would maintain thermal decoys while he and Sarah manipulated terrain features to create cover and delay. Every motion was choreographed. Sprint, dive, conceal, repeat. The enemy adapted with alarming speed, yet Jonah's improvisation and prior planning maintained their fragile advantage. They reached the final ridge leading to the extraction zone. Jonah's breath came in measured bursts, muscles taut with exertion. Mara moved beside him, her small frame agile and precise, a perfect complement to his strategic calculations. Sarah's jamming pulses and sensor manipulation created temporary blind spots, giving them the critical edge. Jonah signaled for the last maneuver, a gravity-assisted diversion using loose boulders, designed to channel enemy units away from their path. The rocks tumbled with precise timing, a cascading disruption that forced the adaptive units into predictable movement patterns. The extraction zone came into view, a prearranged landing pad with a small, heavily shielded transport awaiting them. Jonah signaled, and Mara dashed ahead first, her movements calculated, silent, and precise. Sarah covered from behind, monitoring sensors and sending final pulses to misdirect the approaching units. Jonah followed, sprinting across the final stretch, deploying one last decoy to mask their exit. The transport's engines roared to life as they boarded, shields engaging to counter minor kinetic pulses from distant units. Inside the transport, Jonah allowed himself a brief moment to assess the operation. They had survived a multi-vector assault, manipulated terrain and technology, and navigated betrayal and adaptation. Mara's presence had been pivotal, not only in physical tasks, but as a symbol of moral responsibility and resilience, turning potential annihilation into calculated survival. The transport lifted off, moving rapidly beyond the enemy's immediate reach. Jonah monitored telemetry, noting the enemy's adaptive response, but now they were too far to engage effectively. The plateau and ravine fell behind, dust plumes marking the battlefield of their triumph. Jonah exhaled, feeling the weight of exhaustion, relief, and the moral cost of decisions made under relentless pressure. Mara sat beside him, silent but alert, her eyes reflecting resilience and cautious relief. Sarah monitored systems, ensuring no lingering threats remained. Jonah reviewed the captured intel once more. The data confirmed that the enemy had anticipated human improvisation but underestimated moral and psychological factors, human adaptability, courage under pressure, and the ability to make rapid, morally informed decisions. Jonah realized that their survival and tactical success had been possible not through sheer force, but through discipline, coordination, and strategic exploitation of predictable patterns. The enemy would recalibrate, but the lessons learned were durable. Terrain, timing, and human ingenuity could match, and even exceed technological superiority. As the transport moved toward a secure base, Jonah considered the implications. Mara had survived not by chance, but through courage, trust, and precise coordination. Sarah's skills had amplified their advantage, yet her reliance on logic and calculation highlighted the human element's essential unpredictability. Jonah reflected on the cost: minor injuries, exhausted resources, moral compromises, but also critical victories and intelligence, tactical knowledge, and the preservation of a pivotal life. They landed at a secure facility, greeted by a team prepared to receive them. Jonah ensured Mara was safe, medical evaluation and support immediate. Sarah debriefed the operation, providing analysis on enemy adaptation, potential vulnerabilities, and lessons for future engagements. Jonah filed his own report, emphasizing the integration of improvisation, human resilience, and ethical responsibility into tactical planning. The operation had been brutal, precise, and costly, but the strategic objective had been achieved. Mara looked up at Jonah, eyes wide but steady. "We made it," she whispered. Jonah nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Yes, but the fight isn't over. The world is watching, and our choices ripple farther than we see." Sarah joined them, eyes scanning the horizon from the facility's control deck. "We've learned a lot," she said, "about their operations, about adaptability, and about the limits of control. We survived because we adapted faster." Jonah allowed himself a faint smile. As night fell, Jonah reflected on the operation's moral and strategic calculus. Every decision had consequences, every improvisation carried risk, and every act of courage influenced outcomes beyond immediate survival. Mara had been both a catalyst and a test, revealing the interplay between human resilience and technological systems. Jonah knew that future engagements would demand even greater precision, coordination, and ethical clarity, but now they had learned and survived a lesson that could not be erased. The cliffhanger lingered softly, not as immediate danger, but as lingering consequence. The enemy remained adaptive. Global networks watched, and the balance between technology and human ingenuity would continue to shift. Jonah, Mara, and Sarah had won this battle, but the war of strategy, morality, and survival stretched far beyond the ravine. They had survived through discipline, coordination, and the courageous use of intellect and morality, a blueprint for victories yet to come.